Hi everybody, welcome to today's live stream with our guest Paul Reiffer, which we're going to pull up on screen in a second. So thanks for joining us today. So what we're going to do is Paul's going to take over on this stream, which is nice. I can just sit back and watch, and show us some editing workflow on screen. So Paul, you're on screen now.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm
Excellent.
cool. I'm awake. I've had long hair, which is better than you.
Definitely. I've had my first Corona cut, which didn't go as badly as I thought it would. So there we go. All right. Okay, so now we're looking at your screen, Paul, and we're going to try and get through a couple of edits today. That's the plan.
Yeah.
Yep.
We'll
and get that all wrapped up in half an hour. So we've got two shots. And you're going to take us through two kind of different editing processes. You've already taught me something already from looking at these shots just before we came live. So I shall let you take it away with the first one.
Cool. Okay. So hello everyone. We're going to start off with actually the difference between an iPhone photo and a Phase 1 photo and how those differences can be corrected. So it's quite an extreme. From a mobile camera up to a 100 megapixel or beyond medium format sensor.
Just a little bit, yeah.
Yes. So, and actually, it is a very good point. So, this is a picture on the screen right now in Capture One, and you can obviously load iPhone images into Capture One too. But here is a picture that was taken with an iPhone of a scene that we were photographing where we were actually testing filters. And here is a scene taken with a ridiculously expensive camera compared to the iPhone one, which doesn't look as good. So, and we get this quite often, and there are a couple of reasons for it. So, number one, phone cameras nowadays are processing the image. So they're doing a lot of stuff that the old JPEG modes in cameras would do. So they're enhancing saturation, they're enhancing contrast, but they're also doing a lot of HDR stuff now too. So in comparison, when I go to a standard RAW file from an image, taken out of, for example, a Phase 1 or a DSLR, quite often the difference is quite obvious. And in this particular case, it's actually down to filters as well. So as I said, we were testing filters. There's some ND filter in front of the camera. Some filters, and this is a very well-known brand of filter, it's got quite a reputation for having a green-blue color cast. So obviously we're stood on a bridge in the morning, looking at a lovely sunrise just about to happen. Click the picture. We've got our exposure as correct as we can get. We'll talk about that in a second. But what comes out is a little flatter. So what we're going to do is try and get this picture back to what was there at the time, although this is a little bit too enhanced, my liking anyway.
And so, Paul, what was the filter you had on there? That was just a
there's an ND, it's an ND8, so 3-stop filter just to slow down the water down here, half a second. But we also had a GND up here, so you can see that a little bit because the tops of these mountains here and here are a little bit darker than they are down here, and that's because the graduated filter still has an impact. And actually, the good point with graduated filters, there's no such thing as a V-shaped graduated filter on the mass market. So in this case, I've managed to darken the sky up here, but actually where the sky is the brightest, where I really wanted the filter, I can't do much about it because otherwise I'm going to darken the mountains too. Yeah. Whereas in Capture One, we can fix some of that.
But I guess it helps you get closer to the final result.
So we're getting rid of any overexposure risk, but it's still not quite where we want it to be.
Got it.
So let's first off, we're going to talk about color or white balance in a second, but let's get the detail back. So Capture 120. Amazing new HDR tool. This is actually quite an old file. It was a couple of years ago. I'm finding a lot of my images from a couple of years ago. If I re-edit them in Capture 120, make sure that you do the engine upgrade on the base characteristics thing first. You get a huge difference in what comes out, which is great. So before we start anything, let's put on the lens this was taken with, which was this one. I'm going to turn on chromatic aberration. This lens is a 28mm lens. Is known for some sharpness fall off, and I know there's purple fringing on the edges. So because I know that, I'm just going to save myself worrying about going into here too much because I'm going to dial those in anyway. But using that HDR tool, if we bring down our highlights by quite a lot, so let's bring back all the detail in the sky. Not that much, actually. Let's put it back to about there. We're also going to use the white, so the brightest parts of the image in the sky, sort of this area here and this area here. We're going to bring them back too. And then here's the magic stuff. So let's bring the shadows up. And we have a scene that starts to become alive.
Very nice.
And if we pull our blacks up a little, now you've got some tweaking to do with the black. So the more you pull the blacks up, the less contrast you're going to get. And if you do it too much, we end up with one of those horrific Instagram of 3 years ago shots.
Lovely,
Which looks like a
nice
cartoon.
HDR look going on there. Yeah.
Yeah. So with all of these, a little goes a long way, but use blacks sparingly, because when you pull the black slider up as well as the shadows, you're gonna lose contrast. We want some contrast left in the scene. To give it a bit of punch, we're going to put a little bit of clarity on, not too much. And then here's the fun one, white balance. So I know that this scene has a slight bluish greenish tint. Tint, in this case here, helps us correct for color casting filters. So if you have a filter, typically the glass filters in front of the camera are either a slightly pink or a slightly greeny blue tint. And we can offset that with here. I can't really use the white balance tool, as in the picker. And the reason is because I've got nothing here that's genuinely grey or white. And more importantly, because it was taken at sunrise, so let's have a look at the iPhone shot. Even the stuff that might be grey will have a sunrise tone to it. So the light is warm. So if I tell Capture One, look, let's pick on a white cloud. Ooh, it's getting it wrong. And the reason it's getting it wrong is because at sunrise, that cloud isn't white. The cloud's reflecting some lovely little warm orange sort of sunrise tones. So there's a bit of play that we've got to do here. Now, I know I've got to pull the tint up a little bit, just to correct for that filter. Let's go to about there. And then we're going to pull up our warmth as well to about there. That sort of works. So we're already in a better place for that scene. Then on top of that, I want to get a little more detail on this sky. So let's pull on a new layer, so a new empty layer. I'm just going to use a general gradient mask. You can turn the mask on so you can see what we've drawn. That gradient there, again, it's not going to touch here too much, but what I can do is have a little bit of overlap, and then we're going to use the Luma Range tool to get rid of anything that I've gone over the mountains. Because what I don't want to do, obviously, if I'm going to pull this sky down a little bit and add some clarity, I don't want the top of the mountains to be affected at the same time. And that's the thing that a glass filter can't help me with either. So, Luma Range. I want to affect everything up here in the lightest parts of the image. And let's turn on the mask so we can see what's happening. As I pull the range up, you're going to see it creep up the mountains slowly. And all I'm doing is I'm pulling it up until we get no more mountain in that Luma Range. I'm going to slide this fall off, so it's quite a subtle fall off, so we don't get any hard line in between the area that is masked and the area that's not.
So this is like your perfect digital gradient V-shaped.
Exactly, it's a perfect GND mask.
Yeah.
It's as if we had a GND mask that was the exact shape of this valley, which is what I'd like. But we can do it with software because we can pull up some of the dynamic range from the image as well. So with that set, let's apply that mask. That's good. And then with this mask, what we can do, we could pull down our exposure a little bit, but we're going to get that effect because obviously it's a gradient in here. Instead, what I'm going to use is clarity just to make that punch a little bit more with the clouds. And we're just going to warm up those clouds a little bit more than the rest of the scene. I don't want to warm up the bottom here because it just becomes a bit too saturated, a bit too sort of putrid. But up here, there's a lot of room up here in these clouds to be able to do that with. Down here, we could pull our saturation up a notch or two, but that's it. So effectively, we've just used HDR and some white balance, and that's it. And we've got back to pretty much the scene that was there from, let me just clone this and reset, from there out of the camera. Mm-hmm. So this was here, all of this detail was here, all the data was there, that was what the scene itself was. But because of the filter and because of the limitations we've got with glass filters in terms of balancing a scene for dynamic range, that's the impact that you get raw out of the camera versus what we can then bring it back to in Capture One.
So could you have got away with shooting that without the filter, or it still had a benefit in that respect?
It still had a benefit. So certainly in terms of slowing down, so we obviously want a little bit of movement in the water. I actually did another shot later on, which was about 2 minutes long, which completely flattened this water out.
Right.
And obviously you've got a lot more movement in the clouds. But in terms of, we want a little bit of movement in the water, so we got it up to half a second. And this, from memory, this cloud up here was exceptionally bright as the sun was coming up from the horizon, to the point where if you look here on the iPhone shot, it's actually overdone it. It's overcooked in these areas here. With the iPhone sensor, just obviously can't handle that amount of saturation and brightness. The Phase 1 absolutely can, and more importantly, we can pull it back to all that detail that the iPhone just can't see.
Fantastic.
So, and yes, before anyone notices, there are some horrible little bits over the screen, which are little dusty bits, which we need to do with the dust spot thing or the healing brush, but I'm sure you'll cover that separately.
We want to sit here and watch you do 99 healing spots.
So next one, if everyone's, are you happy with that, David?
Yeah, that's perfect. Anthony,
just very quick and easy.
Just putting his comment on the screen, said, never thought of using gradient and luma range. Exactly. So, the luma range just puts a constraint on any mask that you make, whether you've drawn it by hand, whether it's a field mask, whether it's a radial mask. Quite often I'll do a radial mask and just maybe cut out the shadows a bit if I don't want to make them too dark. So there's all kinds of clever tricks.
And also remember, so if I just put the mask onto grayscale so we can see here, that it has got some bits left over.
But not enough to be significant.
But not enough to be significant. Yeah. But if I was really, really picky about it, remember, even with that all set, I can still go on to my eraser. As I click, it's going to say, do you want to rasterize it? Which means I can't edit the gradient anymore.
Yeah.
But that's okay. Rasterize it, please. I can erase, so let's just turn on that mask again. Let's just turn on my opacity for a start. I can erase all of these bits of the mask and really, really tidy it up.
Yeah.
But I've still got access to that luma range even after that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you could just reluma it. Yeah, if that's a word. Yeah. Let's go. Oh, sorry if I've said your name wrong. How do you put the mask on grayscale? So that's Alt M.
Yeah. So M gets you a red mask. If I do Alt M, it gets you a grayscale mask, but it will remove the image from the view at the same time.
Yeah, but it's perfect for analysing exactly that if you're not sure, because it's quite often hard to see the red overlay on a shot.
Exactly. Let's look at this mountain. The mountain itself is red. Yeah. So if I turn the mask off, there's still red bits there. So it doesn't really help me. Whereas if I switch it into into grayscale, I can see more of what I've done.
Super. Nice one. And Nick says he's constantly amazed what this can do in the hands of true professionals. There we go.
Cool.
You can do it too, Nick. Excellent.
Okay. Next one, a little bit of a fun one. So this one we're going to do some real fun with some split layers. So this is Death Valley, salt flats out at Badwater. Again, we were doing some tests, so we've got some shots beforehand where the difference between the bright area of the sky and down here was just phenomenal. As in, we were putting on like a 6 stock difference in gradient filter, and it still couldn't handle it. It was ridiculous. But most importantly, we want to keep all this detail down here. And in reality, this detail is really, really crisp and crunchy and exciting and stuff. And it fades out a little bit on camera. So let's bring it back. And because it's one of these things where when a landscape feels like an alien sort of landscape, we can play with it a bit more. Where it's literal, we have to bring it back to exactly reality. Otherwise, quite obviously, someone's going to say, well, hold on a minute, that mountain wasn't green.
Yeah.
Whereas when it's more of an abstract sort of a landscape, we've got a little more latitude. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and it's not like we're strolling through salt flats every day of our lives. As well, you might be, but
I am.
Yeah, you are, but not most of us. So no. As you say, you can afford to be a bit more artistic license. I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
So yeah. This is pretty much it is as shot. I'm just going to turn on my lens corrections. One thing we've been telling people a lot to do a lot more now is use this analyze button for chromatic aberration on lenses, just to keep things. In fact, I don't need sharpness correction on this lens. This lens is as sharp as can be. There's no fringing from memory on there. Right. So I've got a couple of things with it. First off, let's, in general terms for the background, I want to brighten it up a little bit. So let's just pull up the brightness a bit more so I can see a bit more of this texture down here. The reason for using brightness rather than exposure is brightness will pull most of the histogram up and squash it towards the end of the bright area. If I use exposure, it doesn't squash, it literally moves it. Mm-hmm. So with brightness, I'm pulling up the dark and the midtones, but I'm not pushing the bits that are already risky and overexposed off the end even further. If I did that with exposure, yes, all the dark areas would come up, but so would the bright areas, and I'd actually blow even more out, and we're shooting into the sun. So brightness up. In general, on the background, let's pull down some highlights. There's not much we can do with this sun because we've pointed directly into it, but I do want that sort of fan shape to come back. So highlights isn't going to quite cut it because this is firmly in the whites area. So highlights will do anything that's sort of top 25, 30%, but the whites is where it's really, really powerful in here. So with whites, let's just pull it back a lot more, maybe to about there, just to get some of this color back in here. Blacks I'm going to leave alone. Shadows, let's pull that up because this is all in shadow down here, just so we can see a bit more. And this is what we effectively is our base image. So this is what I'm trying to do, is get the whole image to a place where it's correctly exposed to within the realm that we can get it to, and it's sort of in the middle of the histogram. You'll see why in a second. With all that done, let's now pull on a new layer. And this layer, we're only going to focus on the sky. So let's call it sky, just for cleanliness. And let's draw over here. I'm not worried about this mountain range. The mountain range can be in silhouette. There's not much detail in here. I could pull it out, but it's not really a feature. The feature is obviously the salt flat.
And it wouldn't look supernatural either, really, would it?
Of course, yeah. So you start getting a little bit sort of weird if we do do too much of the mountain. So, but what I am going to do is on the gradient mask, if I hold down the Option key, I can change just one side of the gradient mask. Normally, as I move it, it moves all together. But if I hold down the Option key, I can change one side at a time. So what I can do with this is, let's pull this down to here. So I want this area here to fall off really quite hard. And this area here to fall off softly so I don't notice the gradient mask has been applied, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So this up here is more solid, and then it fades off slowly into here. Okay, with that gradient, we're gonna do some funky stuff. We're gonna change the white balance independently of the ground. So we've got a white balance. Let's cool it down a little bit, but also let's give it a little bit more of a tone. That's pretty good. Let's pull up our saturation quite a way. Actually, we've got some room on here. So we've now got some nice color back in the sky. Now with that sky, because we are going to affect the whole area of the sky, because it's the highlights, let's pull down our highlights down to, let's say, about half on there. Okay. Clarity. So here's a fun one. Clarity is great for making things stand out and adding contrast. Great. But if I do that in the sky, I'm going to get banding because it's forcing contrast where there really wasn't any. But I can also use it to smooth the sky. So yes, you can use, under your color editor, you've got this function here called skin tone, and we can use that to smooth the color in the sky. But this sky is not one color. It's yellow, orange, purple, blue, everything. So if I do that, I'm going to end up in a mess. Instead, let's just put clarity down to 0. And I've instantly smoothed everything that was in that gradient mask. I haven't affected anything down here because it's not masked. But with the sky, we've just smoothed out the entire area to give it a nice soft transition rather than any banding. Then we've got a weird one with levels. So normally with levels, we use these bottom sliders, which are the output sliders. And the reason is we're trying to make the darks go darker and the lights go lighter and so on. I want to actually restrict how bright the sky is going to come out. So instead of using the bottom sliders, I'm going to use the top one, which is a bit weird. Let's pull that down to about there. So let me undo that so you can see. So I'm using levels to actually force the sky to be softer, to not be quite so harsh when it comes up to its highest point, which is the opposite to what a lot of us do. Okay. So with our sky, that sort of works. That's nice and clean. We've got our flare. We've got a nice little fan above it, and all cool. Let's add a new layer, and we'll call this one, secrets given away, hexagons.
Hexagons.
And with the hexagon thing, so let's turn our mask on again. On this one, we can have a really hard line on that gradient filter. Now, here's a little trick. When you try and angle a gradient filter really near the middle, it's really, really difficult because your mouse doesn't like it. So when you first place the gradient on, what happens is you're near the middle of the gradient and tiny little movements left and right, and it's like trying to fly the flight of the Navigator spaceship or something. Yeah. Let go of it. Move your mouse out to the outside, and the further out you get, the easier it is to control that angle. So we want quite a hard line, and I'm going to make sure that angle matches the ground. Now, at the moment, I know that the ground's not exactly level, but we'll fix that in a second. So place the mask and then go out to the outer edges to make the angle change. With this one, we're going to do the opposite to what we did before. So I want things to stand out. First off, let's warm up. So I don't want these things looking too cold. That looks weird. So let's warm up the hexagons a little bit, back to a more neutral white. They're white salt. So although you would have some impact from the sun color, I still want them to appear relatively neutral.
So they are white in real life, if that's the right.
In real life, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's salt.
Crazy.
It's very, and it's also, it looks nice and fluffy there, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like in powder. Yeah. No. It is hard, brutal, rip your leg open salt.
Skin shredding salt. Yeah.
It's horrendous. So with this one, I want to brighten up the bottom area as well, just a bit. So maybe even just half a stop, something like that. Get a bit more detail out. That's good. Let's pull up our contrast. So contrast overall. So if I do too much, okay. But let's pull up a little bit to about there. Saturation, I'm actually going to desaturate this a little bit. So again, I don't want to do that. So by pulling the saturation up, we can actually see the color tone that it thinks that the salt flats are, which is this pinky purple color. I just want to lose that. I want to make these things a little more neutral. So let's just pull it down a bit, not too much. I still want it to have some color because it should do. It's reflecting from that warm light from the sun. But I want them to appear as white salt flats. And then absolutely the opposite to what we did to the sky. Let's pull our clarity up. So if I'd done this on the whole picture, we'd have a sky that's got that horrible banding in that we saw. So if I put the sky up to here, we get this horrible effect up here. So by using the sky on a negative clarity and having the hexagons on a positive clarity, we actually introduce a hell of a difference between the soft, smooth sky gradient and this harsh, rugged landscape down below with all the contrast.
That's quite a difference in editing, like two extremes for those two
two
areas. But the good thing is it doesn't look weird either. It looks perfectly natural. No. So yeah.
Well, to be honest, this is it's a difficult thing for photographers to say. This is how it feels when you're there. When you're out on those salt flats, this is how it feels. It doesn't feel wishy-washy and wavy and calm, whatever. It's actually pretty rugged. Final thing, let's just pull our levels down. So remember on the first one, we restricted how bright the image could get. Well, on this one, again, I don't want to do that. I want these things to punch a little bit more. So if we pull it to maybe even there, that looks pretty good. Final thing, obviously, well, in fact, two final things. Number one, let's straighten this up because I was lazy when I took that shot and didn't get it right. So now we are level, which is a good place to start. And then second thing, for people that say the healing brush doesn't work, let's have a little play.
What is that, a dust spot or something?
No, it's a lens flare. So,
okay.
Again, it's personal preference. A lot of people love these lens flares, these little spots that come out. Yeah. To me, I do, but it's distracting there in this flat.
Yeah, because it doesn't look... Yeah, it doesn't need to belong there, really.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So let's put a nice soft brush, 100% opacity. I'm going to choose where I want to get it from. Now, luckily, hexagons in the distance look quite random. So let's just pick a bit there. I'm going to paint very roughly there. A bit more there. A bit more there.
Pretty good.
A bit more there. A bit more there. That's not bad. I might just smooth that bit in there with a brush. Yep, there. And then we've got our little lens flare gone.
Fixed. Nice.
All fixed.
Job done.
So, yeah. Job done. And that's it. And just from let me just clone it. I'm just going to make the point of, let's just get back. I could have just done a new variant. That would have saved me a lot of time then. That was a stupid thing to do. Anyway, if we go back to the raw file. So again, these two it's the same scene. It just feels different. This feels more harsh, more rugged, more extreme on the left. The one on the right, obviously we're trying to balance some light as well, but you've got this sort of washed out effect as a result of trying to get the exposure right. So let's just make it punch a little bit more in the final image.
Cool.
That's it.
Fantastic. Got a couple of questions I'm going to throw at you. either of us can answer this. Do the exposure and HDR sliders intensity work equal to all cameras and lens brands? Now I know you shoot primarily phase, but I know you shoot a bit of Sony and Fuji and a few
Canon
other
stuff
bits as
and
well.
Sony stuff. Yep. Do you have the official answer? I have the unofficial answer, which is they seem to work the same way regardless of what camera you've got. On exposure, it's literally the same, because exposure +1 is 1 stop higher, so double the light. Exposure +2 is 2 stops higher, so double the light again. So in exposure, absolutely. In high dynamic range, to my experience, they behave the same. 100% is extreme, 50% is okay, 0 no difference.
I would say the only difference that you might run into is when you hit the limit of that particular camera. So, of course, some cameras might recover the shadows better than others, and then you could push it a bit more before it looks crappy.
Let's use an example. So iPhone, can I pull the highlights back? No,
it just goes.
So even at 100 and with white, all that's happening is I'm just flattening that color. Whereas on the phase 1, if I go back to our background layer, I can pull these highlights back a long way back, and it's still got it because the dynamic range in the camera is capable of recording it.
But otherwise, the effect is But you just might have more joy with, you know, a more modern sensor with higher dynamic range than something that's 5 years old or 10 years old or whatever. So Chuck was asking, whoops, I got rid of his question. Chuck was asking, where was the first photo from?
This one is from Zion National Park in Utah in the US.
There we go. Very nice. And the last question, actually just a compliment. Let's give ourselves a compliment. Art said, great editing and explanations. This is a wonderful one. Some nice tips, even for more experienced. And the good news is, if you want to listen to more of Paul, then in half an hour, you're actually over on your own Facebook channel doing another live broadcast, actually editing some guest photos. Am I right with that?
Yeah, we've got other people's photos that we'll edit. If people want to, we can always take these photos and completely trash them just for fun. So 3:30 UK time over on our channel. We're going to carry on and then pick up some people's ones.
Nice, and the link is in the comments. So if you're looking for Paul's Facebook page, that's where it is as well. I have a couple of other messages too. You're still on screen, Paul, so don't pull any funny faces, or you can if you like, or pretend to slap me. Our next live is on Tuesday, and we're actually going to talk about a new update to Capture One. Just to tease you a little bit, Paul, I know you've played with it. Don't give it away.
No.
So I'm going to be joined on Tuesday with our product manager, Alex, and he's going to take us through some new things are coming. And this is an update. It's not a new version, so it's not something that's going to cost. You don't have to pay for it, regardless of whether you are subscribing or a perpetual license owner. It's just an update to the existing version, but it has some pretty cool stuff in there. And
that's what you should have used your canned applause, David.
My canned applause. I've lost my canned applause maker. Hang on, here we go. Let's see. So, hey, there we go. So that's what we're all going to be doing on Tuesday. Also, don't forget to share your work with us with the hashtag #EditWithUs. We're selecting some to put up on our Instagram pages as well. So any work that you've done in this period, please share with Edit With Us. And if you'd like to see other guests, if you didn't like Paul, which I can understand, then please put in the comments who else you'd like to see drop on and do some editing as well. And if you want to see more, go and join Paul in half an hour's time as well.
Cool.
Fantastic. So thanks everyone for joining us today again. I always learn something. I'd never thought of doing the old negative clarity trick actually on the sky. So that's something I can pass on as well. So thanks again, Paul.
Cool.
And we'll see you all soon. Thanks for joining us, and see you next week for Tuesday. Don't forget to come along. Cheers. Bye now.